Hey everybody, welcome. So this is lesson 4 of the Build Your Own ChatGPT front end in Angular. So now we're getting to the fun part. In the first 3 lessons, I discussed what Angular is, how to install Angular, and then basically the Hello World application. But this is where it's going to get fun. And I'm actually going to start with a blank screen because what we're going to do now is we're going to make our Angular application talk to our Python application that we had done in lesson 3 of the Python part of this project. So there's a couple things we want to have open. So the first thing I want to have open is Google Chrome. So I'm going to go to 2 different repositories. So if we go to github.com kinetic Cs, the first one we want to look at is this ChatGPT API part 3. This is what we had built at the end of lesson 3 of that series. And so there were 4 files, one of which was main.py. And if we look at main.py, the last thing we did is we made some changes to it so that it could handle Angular. And so we have, starting here at line 35, we have an endpoint that is chat. So what we do is when we post content, when we post to the chat API, it is actually going to go call ChatGPT, save the prompt. It'll save the prompt that we're putting in. And then from the conversation, all of the prior prompts will also be passed in to the API. So this part is going to get clear really quickly, but so we're going to get started by creating our ChatGPT application. Now on the other side here in Angular, we have ChatGPT lesson 4. If you just want to skip to the end or you end up not following along and missing something, this is the repository that gets us to the end of this lesson. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm at a terminal. So we're going to say ng new lesson 4. And this is going to create a new project, a new Angular project called lesson 4. And the first question again is, do you want to add Angular routing? And we're going to say yes, because in this case we are actually going to add something to the route provider. And then what style sheet format do we want to use? We're going to say CSS. Okay, so what it's doing now is it is installing all of the Angular packages. And we did this in the Hello World application, but since this is some pretty simple stuff, we're just going to do it again. Okay, so at this point, it is downloading all the packages from NPM. Okay, so now what we've got is we have our lesson 4 project has been created and Git is initialized. So I'm going to go up to File, Open Folder, and then I'm going to open up lesson 4. Okay, so now that I have the project opened, I'm going to go and I'm going to start a new terminal. Now, if I do ng serve, this is going to run. It's going to compile and run the application. So what we want to do now is go back to our browser, and we're going to open up localhost 4200. And this is our initial Hello World application. So first thing we want to do is clear out all of the stuff that Angular was nice enough to give us. So we go back to Google Visual Studio Code, and we're going to go to under app, we go to appcomponent.html. And I'm going to remove everything but the router outlet down at the bottom. So now when I hit Save All, if I go back, and now localhost 4200 has absolutely nothing in it. So when we are working with Angular, everything is based on components. So every form is a component. Inside of the form, you can have panel areas that are components. Angular is basically made up of sets of components. So to create a component, you use the ng generate component command. So we want to create a form called chat form where we're going to enter our prompt in. So I'm going to Control C so that I'm not running ng serve anymore. And I'm going to say ng generate, and that you could shorten this to just ngg, but I'm going to type it all out. Component, and then I want everything organized properly in directories, so I'm going to create a directory called features. And then inside that directory, I'm going to create chat-form, and then use the ---- standalone. Okay, so the standalone option is new as of Angular 15. So if you've worked with Angular before and you haven't seen Angular 15, standalone became part of the main part of Angular in 15. I think it was introduced in 14. I definitely didn't use it until 15. Okay, so we're going to create this component. And as soon as we do this, it has now created for us a features directory. And inside the features directory, we have our component. So we have our chat form component that has a HTML, a TS, and a CSS. So from that, what we're going to do is we're going to put that component on our screen. And so we're going to do that by making that part of the router, part of the routing module. So when we come here and we look at constant routes route, what we want to do is add an entry. And so we're adding an entry which is an object, which is a screen we're going to go to. So the first thing we do is we want to define the path. So we say path and then two single ticks. So that's going to create a path of nothing. Now we want component, and we want the component that we just created to be the component. So we're just going to start typing, and as soon as I get to chat form component, I just hit tab. And now what this did is this added the component, chat form component, to the routes. It also, because I did it the way I did it, I did not have to import it. So normally, if you don't take advantage of the way that Visual Studio Code and Angular help you, you would actually have to import chat form component from this location. But because it thinks enough for you, as soon as we put in chat form component and hit tab, it added it to the routes. And I want this to actually be double quotes here. Okay, so we've created our path and our component. So now the component that we actually created, all it does right now is it just says chat form works. But if I go in here and I do a save all, and then I come back down and go ng serve, it's now going to compile that component. And when we come back to our code, we should see chat form works. Okay, so let's go back and review how we actually got here. So this is coming from the component that says chat form. If we go to the index, we can put here I am index.html and put a break in it. And then copy that. And if I go to the app component, I can say I am app.component.html. Okay, and then inside of that we see the component works, or the chat component works. So I'm going to hit save all. And now when I come back to my code, you see it says I am index.html, because that is the outer container. Then we say I am app component.html, and then chat form works. So now what we want to do is we want to create this chat form in such a way that we can put a prompt into it. So I'm going to come up here to the chatform.html, and we don't have any style sheets, we don't have any styling, so all I'm going to do is go text area, and then width is 300 pixels, height HEIGHT, height is 300 pixels, and of course I gotta actually put my styling right. Style equal. Okay, so now we have a text area with a style on it. So now if I save that, we go back to our code, and now you see, instead of it saying the chat component works, I've got a field here. Okay, so now I got to make this, now that I've got this field, I got to actually make it do something. And so what we have to do is we have to bring this component to life. And we're going to bring it to life by having it talk to our code that's over here in PyCharm. So I'm in PyCharm, and I've loaded up the ChatGPT FastAPI Part 3. So what I would recommend you do is just go to the GitHub repository and bring it down to make sure that it's the right version and everything is perfect. So what's going to happen now is when we call the chat endpoint from post, it is going to take the data from that we pass in. Now, because we're passing it from Angular, we're going to be passing it as JSON. It is going to get the JSON from the post, and then it is going to call the chat function that we put in the ChatGPT class. So inside this chat function, what we do is we get our API key, we get the history of the chat that we're working on, then we form the messages, and then we send the chat, and then we save it back to the database. So that's what we did in this application. But what I want to do now is I want to go hit here and go, I'm going to rerun, because I didn't know it was running. So now we are running the API. So if we go to 127.0.0.0 or 127.0.0.1 port 8000, we're going to be calling this code that is running out of PyCharm. Now in Angular, calling APIs is kind of a multi-step process. So the first thing we need to do is we actually need to create a service, and we're going to create what's called a data service. And then that data service is what talks to the other website, the port 8000 website. So now to create a service, you do it the same way. You do an ng generate, but in this case, we're creating service. And I want to have a service that's called data service, so I'm just going to call it data. And so this created two files for us, a data service and a data service spec. The spec is for testing. But so now we have this data service. Now, in order to keep myself from screwing this whole thing up, I'm going to refer back to the GitHub repository. But before I do that, the first thing I have to remember to do is that the data service is going to use the HTTP client module in order to connect to the other server, connect to the API. So I need to go into app module, and I need to import HTTP client module. Okay, and notice that it did not get it for me. So I'm going to go over here to my GitHub and make sure that I get it right. So I'm over here on my ChatGPT 4 GitHub. I'm going into source, then I am going into app, then I'm going into app module. And so we're importing the HTTP client module from Angular Common HTTP. So let me just copy that. And paste it in. Now, once we import it into app module, we also need to add it to our list of imports. Okay, so this is all we're actually doing to the app module. We are just telling the program as a whole that it is going to be using the components out of the HTTP client module. So I'm going to save this file. And now I'm going to go back to my data service. So in my data service, what a data service does is it operates asynchronously. So anytime you go out and you ask for something from another site, so we're going to the Python code, and then it's going to call ChatGPT. Well, that isn't necessarily a fast action. So what we want to do is we want to have that run in the background. And so your component itself, you don't want it to be locked up while it's waiting for this HTTP to be complete. So you're going to do it in a data service. So let me go back and let's look at the data service code that I have in here. So inside the data service, again, there's not very much code here. We're only looking at 27 lines of code. So I'm actually going to just copy and go into the data service from here. So let's look at what this is doing. So we are importing HTTP client from the Angular Common HTTP. So keep in mind, in the module, we imported the client module. Now here we're importing the client. So we have a class called data service. And we're going to, first thing we're going to do is we're going to declare three variables for the class. The first one is UID, which we're not actually going to use yet. The second one is URL, which is the URL that we're going to. And then T is just a variable that we're going to get the response in. So in our constructor, we set this.url equal to localhost 8000. Now keep in mind, localhost 8000 is actually running out of our PyCharm IDE. So the URL that we're calling is localhost 8000. And then we're going to create a function. In this case, we're going to create a function that has form ID, which basically is the endpoint, and then the prompt data. So this is the prompt that we're going to pass in. So we've got a function that is inside of this data service class. And then what we do is we take in the endpoint and the data. We're going to create this JSON object. And then what we're really doing is this one line here. We are setting this T equal to HTTP post. We're posting to the URL, and we're sending it the prompt data. And when that comes back, we're going to return this data. So this is what the service is doing. The service is just acting as this pass-through, and it's calling the HTTP post component or method. So now what we want to do is we want to tie this whole thing together. So at this point, we have our chat form, and all our chat form has in it is a text area. And then the chat form comes with its chat form component. And this is the TypeScript that brings it to life. So what I want to do is go over to here, go over to my code. And again, this is not very much code, and we are in the features chat form. And chat form component is actually going to only be about 35 lines of code. So let me just copy that, and we'll bring that over and talk our way through it. So in this case, we're at chatform component.typescript. Now, what are we doing here? Okay, most of this code is actually the default code, but what we need is we have our component and we have our onInit. Now, onInit is not the constructor, and the reason I'm actually including it is to show you the difference. The constructor right here, this executes only once. This executes when the program is loaded, and it's creating a variable of the data service type, which is what we just created. We created a class of the data service. When this loads, we're going to create an instance of the data service class. We're creating a data service object, and that's created in the constructor. Now, the onInit executes every time that component is initialized. So every time you go to the page, it is going to call the ng-onInit. So the constructor is only going to get fired once, but the ng-onInit is going to get fired every time the display is called. So now all we're going to put in here is we're going to create a post form variable, or a function. And in this function, we are going to create the content that's going to get passed to our Python code. We're going to console log it, and then we're calling this function postform. So remember over here in the data service, we created postform. And we're passing in the endpoint and the data. So up here, we are calling it, we're passing in chat, and we're passing in this object called form data. Now, from there, we do a thing called a subscribe. And this is one of those things you just kind of memorize at first, and eventually you'll understand how it works. But what this is doing is it's saying, okay, data service, we want you to go off and call HTTP client. But we know that you're not going to return data right away. So we're going to subscribe to your action. And when you've completed, we're going to fire the subscribe function, and what gets returned by you, which was this this.t function or variable. Remember, we're returning this.t. Well, this.t is actually going to become the data inside of the subscribe. So then what we're going to do from there is we're just going to console log it, and we're going to do an alert. So we're going to do an alert of this data choices 0 message content. That just happens to be where your answer from your prompt happens to be from the ChatGPT API. We could have, over on the Python side, made it a little cleaner and not pass the whole thing back, but I don't want to change that code at this point, so we're going to leave it the way it is. So now we have this function called postform, but we've got no way to call it. Now, a couple of other things. We have this thing called this.content, and that is the variable that needs to be tied to the HTML in the template. And so let's do that. So we're going to go over to here. So we went back to our template. We're going to use something called ng-model. Now, let me explain a couple of things. When you are passing data into a template from the outside, you use square brackets. Okay, so any directive that has square brackets is pulling something from the .ts file and bringing it into the template. Anything in braces, what are these things called? Parentheses, are sending things to the TS file. So brackets are to the template, parentheses are to the TS file. If you have both, like this, it is a two-way function. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the ng-model directive, and we're going to say ng-model equals content. What this does is this ties this text area on the screen to this variable over here called content, this content. So every time the value of this text area changes, the value of this .content will change. Conversely, if we were in the code and we changed the value of this .content inside of the .ts file, it's going to change the text area on the screen. But now what we need to do is we need a button to push. So we haven't styled anything yet, so we're just going to put an anchor tag. And now this time, we're going to use click. So remember, it's in parentheses. So click means we're calling something in the .ts. Click actually means it's the click event when we click this link. So I'm going to call post form like that. And then ask ChatGPT is what we're going to have here. So when I save everything and rerun it, oops, I now need to do an ng serve. Now when we rerun it, we've got a text area that's on the page that is tied to a variable called content. When this anchor tag is clicked, it's going to go over here and it's going to call this function called post form. Inside a post form, it's going to set an object where we have the content variable equal to this content. Then it is going to call the post form function that is in the data service. It's going to pass in the endpoint that it needs and the data that it needs. And then when ChatGPT returns the data, it's going to first put it in a local variable called this.data, and then it's going to alert the answer on the screen. So everything compiled. Now let's see if everything works. So we're going to go back over to here. We're in lesson 4. Okay, we have a link down here. It's kind of nondescript. Okay, how far is the moon from the sun, from the earth? And a question mark. I had asked ChatGPT. And I get back the response that says the average distance between the Earth and the Moon is about 400 kilometers. Now let me do a right click and do an inspect so you can see what's happening. So if I go over here to the network tab, what is the moon made of? And I hit Ask ChatGPT. And now it says the moon is primarily made of rock with its composition consisting of various types of rocks, such as bauxite and anthracite. Now, it is storing these prompts and these responses as I see it, or as we interact with this, we're storing the prompts. So I can now say how many people have visited it. Now, because it has got the chat history of what's going on, it's going to know we're talking about the moon. So I'm going to ask ChatGPT. As of September 2021, a total of 12 astronauts have walked on the moon. So that is the answer that we're looking for in the context to which we're looking for it in. So it actually went out and even answered the question of who are all the people who have been to the moon. So as you can see, it's ugly, and in the next lesson, we're going to start to pretty it up, and we're going to start to put chat history, and we're going to start to build it out. But you can see just in these first 4 lessons, and mostly in this lesson, we were able to write an Angular application that talks to our FastAPI Python application that we created in that other course that then go and talk to ChatGPT. Now, if you want to use artificial intelligence in your business, this is really the place to start. Start writing a front end to an API. We're already accessing data because we have a database that we're storing our prompts in. So this is the start that we needed to get to some really cool stuff that we're going to do in the upcoming lessons. So I will see you then.